When you hear this passage, you're going to wonder why in July, June, anytime this summer. Think about the sermon series theme, Emerge. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent to God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And the angel came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there will be no end." Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be holy, and he will be called Son of God. And now your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren, for nothing will be impossible with God." Then Mary said, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." Then the angel departed from her. Our second lesson this morning. Just prior to this passage, Jesus had already been crucified. The Jews didn't want Jesus or the other 2 men to remain on the cross, as it was the day of preparation. Joseph from Arimathea asked Pilate if he could take the body of Jesus. Joseph was a secret follower of Jesus because he was afraid of some of the leaders. Pilate gave his permission, so Joseph came and took Jesus' body away. Nicodemus, who earlier had come to Jesus at night, went with Joseph. He brought about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. These 2 men took Jesus' body and wrapped it with the spices in pieces of linen cloth, which is how they buried the dead. In the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. In the garden was a new tomb that had never been used before. The men laid Jesus in that tomb because it was nearby, and they were preparing to start their Sabbath day. Early on, the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb while it was still dark, and she saw that the large stone had been moved away from the tomb.
Well, it turns out that today's sermon is misnamed. Brenda talked about all of the butterflies around in the sanctuary, and butterflies don't make cocoons, they make chrysalises, and so it really should be tombs and chrysalises, but that doesn't have a good ring to it. So we're sticking with tombs and cocoons, as unscientific as it is. And honestly, I did not know the difference between a cocoon and a chrysalis until I started doing some research yesterday, because I had this nagging feeling there was a difference and I'd better figure out what it is. And so I went and did a little research on YouTube, and I went to SciShow Kids. And they've got a great 4-minute video on the 4 stages of the life cycle of a butterfly. The difference between chrysalises and cocoons is all right there in that little video. There are 4 stages. Stage 1 is the egg. And they hatch from the egg when they're mature enough to eat their way out of it. And then they're in the, I have to look at larva stage, stage 2, and they start out by eating the rest of the egg because it's good nourishment, and then they start eating leaves and they start growing, and caterpillars have an exoskeleton, and so eventually they get too big for the exoskeleton and they shed it, and then they grow another exoskeleton which they make expansive by taking a deep breath while it's still soft. And then it hardens, and they go through that several times as caterpillars, part of the larva stage, stage 2. And then when they get big enough, they anchor themselves to a branch, and their exoskeleton becomes the chrysalis that they are in for stage 3, the pupa stage. And in the pupa stage, that's where the big magic happens, where the metamorphosis takes place. And when it's complete, they emerge from the chrysalis as a butterfly, an adult, and the stage 4 of their life cycle, and they go and eat nectar and lay eggs. Well, I guess the men don't lay eggs. The male butterflies don't lay eggs, but they help the female butterflies lay viable eggs. And it is, as Brenda was saying, a pretty amazing cycle that insects have to become their adult versions of themselves. Moths have a similar 4-stage process. Most of them, though, make cocoons, and there are a few apparently that make chrysalises. But they go through similar metamorphosis process in the pupa stage when they are in their cocoons. And if you really know this already, please be patient with me, because I found it really exciting to learn about, particularly what happens in that stage, in the chrysalis, in the cocoon, for these insects. This is how Scientific American describes it. First, the caterpillar digests itself, releasing enzymes. So it's in that chrysalis or in the cocoon, if it's a moth. It dissolves itself, releasing enzymes to dissolve all of its tissues. If you cut open a cocoon or chrysalis at just the right time, caterpillar soup will ooze out. But the contents of the pupa are not entirely amorphous mess. Not entirely an amorphous mess. Several highly organized groups of cells known as imaginal discs survive this digestive process. Before hatching, when a caterpillar is still developing inside its eggs, it grows these imaginal discs for each of the adult body parts it will need to mature into a butterfly or moths. Discs for its eyes, its wings, its legs, and so on. Once a caterpillar is disintegrated into its tissue, except for these imaginal discs, the discs use this protein-rich soup, as it was, what the caterpillar was before it was digested. They use this protein-rich soup all around them to fuel the rapid cell division required to form the wings, antennae, legs, eyes, genitalia, and all the other features of an adult butterfly or moth. That middle stage of goo to become who they're called to be. A couple weeks ago, during the time with the children, we had read Psalm 8, which has that beautiful image, when I consider the moon and the stars that you've made, what are human beings that you're mindful of them, God? And I asked the kids, what makes them go, wow? Essentially, I was asking them, what fills them with awe? And one of the things that fills me with awe is the night sky, on a star-filled sky on a dark night. It's one of the things that just wows me. The vast universe fills me with awe when I consider the stars and the moon and all that is in the sky, and consider that a lot of those stars that I see are not stars, they're whole galaxies with billions of stars of their own in them. I'm filled with awe. Another thing that fills me with awe is that birth works, that human gestation works. We each start out as two gametes, essentially two half cells, an ovum and a sperm, and they get together and they form one cell. And that one cell divides, it replicates itself, and those two cells replicate themselves, and those 4 cells replicate themselves, and those 8 cells replicate themselves, but they're just copies of themselves. Just a gob of duplicate cells. And then at some point, a cell or a small group of cells say, we're going to be the liver, we need to be on the inside, okay? And the cells that are going to be the skin end up on the outside. And it works. At least a lot of the time it works. We end up with what stuff we need pretty much right where it belongs. The cells that are going to become the skin end up on the outside. The cells that are going to become our fingernails don't try to be eyeballs, even though they started out exactly as the same as the cells that become our eyeballs. The cells that become our blood vessels and the cells that become our nervous system spread throughout the whole glob of cells. But the cells that are going to become our eardrums don't try to do that next to our kneecaps. It just is stunning to me. And all of it, the metamorphosis of the caterpillar in the dark of the cocoon or the chrysalis, the metamorphosis of this glob of duplicate cells in the darkness of the womb, it all takes place in the dark. Barbara Brown Taylor once said, new life starts in the dark. Whether it is a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb, new life starts in the dark. Not only new life, but I think the cocoon and the tomb remind us that new life, that is metamorphosis, starts in the dark. None of us chooses to enter the cocoon or the tomb. Well, we might say we want a cocoon. When life gets to be too much, we want to go home and wrap a blanket around ourselves, and we call that cocooning. But it's not really cocooning. Because if we were really going to cocoon, we would become caterpillar goo for a while and go through a big transformation. What we really want to do is withdraw and feel safe. And the cocoon is anything but safe. We're in the chrysalis stage. We become something different. And who wants to do the hard, messy work of metamorphosis? But sometimes life forces it on us. Sometimes life forces us into that darkness of the cocoon, of the chrysalis. This is Hank Green, and he's digitally famous. Does anybody in the sanctuary know who Hank Green is? Okay, yay, one person. And maybe a couple on Zoom now, maybe. But he's only digitally famous. His brother, John Green, is a little more famous than he is. John Green is famous for being a young adult fiction writer. Probably his most famous book is The Fault in Our Stars. But John is also digitally famous because of his collaborations with Hank. In 2007, Hank and John Green lived thousands of miles apart, so they started posting video blogs to each other, video letters essentially to each other, on a strange new platform that was called YouTube. People began tuning in. And daily, originally, now it's weekly, the Vlog Brothers, as they called themselves, their posts became viral hits. Over time, the brothers grew that single channel into a sprawling collection of businesses, including a production studio called Complexly. It makes some of the most entertaining educational content on YouTube, on the internet, and it's all available for free. They do it through sponsorship and ad sales. One of the complexly produced programs is SciShow Kids, that I went to learn about the 4 stages of life of butterflies. On Friday, Hank posted his weekly Vlog Brothers video, which I'm going to play for you.
Good morning, John. Almost 10 years ago, I got on stage wearing a lanyard in the worst way possible and told a room full of people something that I still think is true. You have no obligation to your former self.
There is one person I can say objectively that I am smarter than, and it is me 4 years ago. He knew like all the things that I currently know, except less. And he had all the life experiences that I currently have, except fewer. So why do I have an obligation to a guy who not only is dumber than me, but literally does not exist?
You are smarter than you were in the past. So you know there's one person in this universe that you're smarter than for sure. Whoever you were in the past. And you have more life experience than you did in the past. And Hank says, therefore, you are not obligated to that dumber, less experienced person. How's that for a freeing thought? He goes on.
If the wisdom of the last 10 years and knowing full well that I am, as that guy 10 years ago said, smarter than him, I could add some nuance to that statement. Yes, my former self is dumber than me.
And I am going to try to get this to actually play as a video rather than just these jerky little pictures. So let me try that again.
If the wisdom of the last 10 years and knowing full well that I am, as that guy 10 years ago said, smarter than him, I could add some nuance to that statement. Yes, my former self is dumber than me. No, they don't exist. But I am also just a story that I tell to myself about myself. That's what I am.
I am just a story I tell to myself about myself. We don't have time to unpack that, but I don't want to let it go by without just calling your attention to that idea. You are a story you tell to yourself about yourself. You might have noticed that Hank put his hand up to his bangs and there was hair there when it came away. He was recently diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he's now several weeks into chemotherapy and the hair is coming out. That's what was going on. In the context of today's sermon, I think we could say that Hank was forced into the chrysalis. He was forced into the dark of the tomb, even. Yes, Hodgkin's lymphoma is a highly treatable form of cancer, and Hank's diagnosis came really early in the course of the disease, and still we can say that Hank has been thrust into a chrysalis of metamorphosis. That does actually sound pretty good together, chrysalis of metamorphosis. And I think that we can hear in the rest of the video blog post some of the ways Hank Green is already experiencing the metamorphosis, that it's not just goo for him now, but stuff is starting to grow already.
And so there is something kind of tricky about having no obligation to my former self. It is easy, I think, too easy these days, sometimes, to lose connections to our past, to our friends, to our communities, to our families, to our places and our nations and our religions and our histories. Because ultimately it is, probably true that those things are arbitrary. We just happened into them. And maybe good, maybe bad, there are easier things in life to do than to feel connected to those things. Like TikTok is the easiest thing, right? Smartphone games are very easy. Doing what you got to do to get your work done, it's easy to prioritize that because you got to pay the bills. The kinds of investments that we make in connection, I think, are harder, if in part because they're not necessary. We are not obliged to maintain them. Now, some of them we are. We feel that obligation, and sometimes we don't. This is very different for different people. But I think the amount of obligation that we feel to our former selves, to our communities, to our families, I think it's safe to say that even if it's high for you, it is on average lower for society as a whole than it was 50 years ago. John, when I was in high school, I was a bit of a punk, or I like to think of myself that way. I listened to the Dead Milkmen and Rancid and Operation Ivy and The Clash, and I did not want to have a normal, standard life. Because, of course I didn't. I was a high school student. But I definitely didn't want to be a businessman. I didn't want to be a lawyer. And I remember having the thought many times that when I was 40 years old, I wanted to get a mohawk. Because that would prove that I had a job where you could get a mohawk, which would mean that I had succeeded in the 17-year-old Hank's version of what a cool life was. And honestly, that's dumb. It's silly. Until quite recently, I had a job where getting mohawk would have made my job and the jobs of my peers harder. It was just like a little, not like substantially, but enough. But that doesn't mean that I didn't think about it. I totally did. I thought about what I owe that former version of myself. And my thought was, nothing. He's dumber than me and he doesn't exist. But look, I am a story that I tell to myself. And 17-year-old me is a vital part of that story. I am not him, but I love him. I care about him. I care about and love a lot of people who don't exist anymore, whether they've died or they've just changed. Like, I care about and love 20-year-old Catherine, and she's not that same person anymore, but I still love 20-year-old Catherine, and I also love 43-year-old Catherine. 17-year-old me was so certain and passionate and scared and wild and often very kind. He was a good guy. He was kind of wonderful, and he became me. And I feel like I was given an opportunity this week to honor him. So here I am, John. I do not have no obligation to my former self. I have the amount of obligation to my former self that I want to have, and I want to have some. John, I'll see you on Tuesday.
I think our church is in a cocoon time. We're in the pupa stage of the church life cycle. We are in the chrysalis, participating in a time of transformation. We're not completely caterpillar goo. And I suspect that there are some imaginal discs in us to help us have what we need when we emerge from this chrysalis time. And still, I think that we are there in the chrysalis. There are a few things I want to tell you about this stage of life in the church's life cycle. The first is that many churches are experiencing a cocoon time. I was at the Northern California Nevada Conference annual gathering the last 3 days, and I talked to colleagues about how things were going in their churches. And in one form or another, they were talking about how their churches were in a process of transformation, of metamorphosis. Some of it relating to being in the post-COVID emergency, whatever, that we are in now. And some of it because of other things that are going on in their churches, transitions in leadership, deaths of vital people, other things like that, that have made them move into the cocoon. So we're not alone. The second thing I want to tell you is that each church is a different species of butterfly. I'm stretching this metaphor too far, but that the other congregations that are experiencing chrysalis time right now, like we are going to emerge looking different from how we are going to emerge from this chrysalis time that we are in. And third is that our obligation to our former self as church is connected only to our love for what we were. That's the only reason we have an obligation to our former selves. And that the obligation is completely subordinate to the transforming love of God that is beginning to work in us. It is transforming us into whatever that species of butterfly is. No one knows for sure how Jesus was conceived. I've got ideas, but no one is certain. We only know that he came to life out of the darkness of the womb. And no one knows for certain how Jesus was resurrected. I've got ideas, but no one knows for certain. The only thing we know for certain is that something happened. Something happened while Jesus' body was in the darkness of the tomb, and that new life was the result. Likewise, no one knows for certain what God is going to do with us in the darkness of the chrysalis. I've got ideas about possibilities. I hope you've got ideas about possibilities. But we don't know for certain what's going to emerge at this point. What we do know is that we can trust God is at work in us and through us, bringing about new life. Thanks be to God. Amen.